In this tutorial, we're going to be talking about how to create a wizard. And we're going to be building upon the information we covered in the previous tutorial where we talked about how to create a menu. A wizard is basically the same thing as a menu. The only real difference is that a wizard relies entirely upon the index of the pages to set them in order. And then we can step through a wizard by using buttons such as next or previous or back buttons. Now, before I get into the details of how to set up the wizard, I want to point out something about the way I've got this set up. This is the Castle Storm scene, and you'll recall from the previous tutorial we were using a perspective camera so that we could have the foreshortening effect when panels come to and move away from the camera. But for the wizard, I've decided to use an orthographic camera because I don't want any foreshortening effects. So you'll see here we have our menu panels, and we're not going to be using those in this tutorial. We're going to go ahead and skip past those. But you see that they're there. And the regular camera, you may not be able to see it. It's kind of hidden behind this sound icon. But there's a camera here. And that is what renders the regular menu that we dealt with in the last tutorial. But I also have a second camera set up, and that's up here. And I've put it up here so that it's kind of out of the way, so I can deal with the stuff down here without the stuff up here getting in the way. Now let's center in on this a little bit. And you'll see that it is an orthographic camera. And you'll probably run into a situation like this a lot of times in creating your games. You're going to want to use a separate GUI camera. So for instance, in a first-person shooter, you may want to have some on-screen controls or status indicators like a health bar or something like that. And you want to render that with a separate camera from the main camera that you use to walk through your level. And typically your GUI camera is going to be orthographic, since that's the easiest way to get pixel-perfect rendering. Now let me point out some of the settings on my second camera that allow it to work. First, when you go to add a second camera, you're going to want to go to Game Object, Create Other, and then select Camera. And you'll notice when you add a new camera here, it comes with an audio listener component. And if you leave it like that, and your main camera has an audio listener component, then you're usually going to get some kind of a warning in the console that you have two audio listeners, and Unity only lets you have one. So when you create a new camera, right-click on the audio listener and remove that component, as you probably won't be needing that. And if we're just using this for GUI, we could probably go ahead and remove the flare layer and also the GUI layer, which refers to Unity GUI, which we're not using here. So if you're not using Unity GUI, then you can remove that as well. Now, as you'll see, we added this new camera, and now it's screwed up our game view. So you can see it's trying to render what's in front of it, and it's overriding the main camera. So we're not seeing what the main camera is seeing. So there's a few things we need to do. First, we need to set the clear flags to either depth only or don't clear. And already you can see that now we can see what our main camera is seeing in the game view. The second thing is you want to make sure that your secondary camera has a higher depth value than your main camera. And if we were to look at the main camera, we'd see it's currently set to -1. So 0 will work because that's a higher depth value. And since we're going to be using this just to interact with UI items, we probably want to set the culling mask so that it will only render the GUI items. So for instance, I could put this camera down here if I wanted to in front, so it's actually looking at the same stuff that the main camera is looking at, but it won't render that stuff because I set the culling mask. So for instance, right now if I set it, first set it to nothing so it clears all of them, and then I say just GUI. Now it's only going to be rendering objects in the GUI layer. So as you can see, I move it around and it's not doing anything. Now if I move it over here in front of these other GUI items, you can see it's actually rendering those. And then once you set the culling mask on that, you may want to also go and set the culling mask on the main camera, because you don't want the main camera rendering your GUI stuff either, because if your GUI stuff is somewhere where the main camera can see it, you'll wind up rendering it twice, and it probably won't look like you want it to at all. So we'll select the main camera, and you'll see the culling mask is set to everything. That's by default. So we can drop that down and uncheck GUI, and now it's going to render every layer except for the GUI layer. Now the last thing we need to do is select the UI manager and tell it which cameras we're going to be using to interact with our GUI controls. So in this example scene, we have both our main menu, which uses our main camera, and then we have our wizard, which uses our GUI camera. So as you'll see in this version of EasyGUI, the UI manager has a UI cameras array where you can assign multiple cameras. If you're only using one camera, you can drag your camera onto the one slot here. And if you're going to use more than one camera, you can enter the number here. In our case, it's 2. And we'll just drag our GUI camera on here. And this tells the UI manager which cameras it needs to check for UI touches and clicks. Okay, so let's go back to our GUI camera. I'm going to delete this one that I just created. We don't need that because our GUI camera is already set up the way we want it. And you can see I've made the wizard panel manager a child of the camera. And this is just for convenience, because if I decide I want to move the camera somewhere else, all the GUI stuff goes with it. And this is also useful if you are using, let's say, a first-person view camera and you want your controls to always stay oriented towards the camera. If you're not using a separate GUI camera, then you can make your controls children of that camera, so when the camera moves around, the controls always follow it and always have the same relative orientation toward it. So let's take a look at page 1 of our wizard. And this is a panel. And you can see I already have some controls added to this panel. And I've got a scroll list and a toggle button which has 3 states. By the way, toggle buttons can have an unlimited number of states. And I have a text box. And I have a next button. Now this next button doesn't have to know what panel comes next, because we saw in the previous menu tutorial that each button, like for instance the options button, had to know what panel it was going to go to. So we would actually enter in options in the options button inspector so that it would know to bring up the options panel as opposed to the new multiplayer game panel. But if I select this button, you'll see this is also a UI button change panel component, just like we used in the menu tutorial. But the difference is, whereas we had the change type set in the menu to use bring in forward, bring in back, in this case we are only going to be using the forward and back. And this tells the panel manager for this wizard to move forward and backward in the wizard based upon the index value of each panel. So let's discuss the index value. Okay, I've selected my page 1 panel, and you'll see that the index is set to 0, and that means it's going to be the first panel in the wizard. And if I go and check on page 2, the index is 1, and page 3, the index is 2. And that sets the order in which the panels will appear when I click Next. Another thing to note about this next button is I could actually move this next button out from that panel so that it's just always right there on the screen. And when we go from panel to panel, the panel can move behind it and the next button will always stay there. And that'll still work because it's still just telling the panel manager to move to the next panel. So if you just want to use one next button and one back button, you can just put one of each on your screen and it'll just move you through the wizard. But in this case, what I've done, I've actually put separate next and back buttons on each panel. Now what makes this wizard go is the transitions. So it's just like in the menu example. I have bring in forward, bring in back, dismiss forward, dismiss back, transition set up. And you can see that, for instance, when this panel is brought in the forward direction, it's going to start at plus 20 on the x-axis, which is going to be out of view of the camera, as you can see. If you look at our position, we're about at 20 right there. And then it's going to end up at 0. And this is another reason it's often handy to put your panels as children to the camera, because then, for instance, I've got my panel manager positioned at 0, 0, 10. So that's 10 units in front of the camera. And so it's real easy to keep track of where we are relative to the camera that way. And then when I look at my panel and I see that when I bring the panel in, I'm wanting to move from here to here, 0, 0, 0. If we go ahead and move it to that position, you see it's perfectly centered in front of the camera. So that's another reason it's useful to make your panel manager and your panels all children of the camera that will render them. So let's look at some more of these transitions. If we look at the dismiss forward, we're going to go from our starting position, which is centered in front of the camera, to -20 on the x-axis. And if you'll look here, that's right about there, and that's well off screen. And if we looked at some of these others, you'd see they're just versions of these. Bring in back while we're moving in the back direction. So the start position is going to be right here where it is, and the end position is going to be here at 0. So you can see already when we're moving backwards, our panels are going to move like this. And when we're moving forwards, they're going to move like this. Or if this one were dismissed, it would move like this. So it's real easy to set up these kinds of transitions using the transition editor. Now I already have a script that's going to bring the first panel of this wizard in when we start the scene. And so let's go ahead and preview this. And there it slides into view, and we can select items here, and when we're ready we hit next, and it moves to the next one. And if we want to go back, we can click the back button here, and it'll take us back. And let's look real quick at that back button we just clicked. Actually, that was on page 2. And you'll see that the change type is set to back, and that's the only information it needs. So we could actually move this button out of that panel if we wanted to, and just keep it on screen here all the time. And we could do the same with the next button. And we'll get the same behavior. Of course, now I've got 2 next buttons there, but we could just leave these here if we wanted to and navigate our menu that way. And when we get to the beginning of the wizard, we'd want to just disable this button. And when we get to the end of the wizard, we'd either want to disable this or change it out with a different button that says finish or something like that. But as you can see, it's probably a little bit easier to work with wizards, since all you have to set up is the index of each panel to determine the order of the pages. And then you can simply use these next and back buttons by setting the change type to either forward or back, as well as making sure you have told it which panel manager that it's going to control.